We've talked about the bullying in the Republican Party. We've talked about the rise of fascism in the Republican Party. We've talked about all these, the different pieces of how there's basically been a takeover of rationality and common sense within the party of Dwight Eisenhower. In fact, I think you could argue, to interrupt myself here, I think you could argue that Dwight Eisenhower actually saved the Republican Party from itself. Right, in the 1920s, the Republican Party had gone full libertarian with the election of Warren Harding in 1920. And he was elected on a platform of undoing government regulation, privatizing government functions. The slogan that he used in his election campaign was more business in government, less government in business. In other words, privatize, deregulate. And his other slogan, the main one that he ran on, was called a return to normalcy. And what Warren Harding meant by that in 1920 was dropping the top 91% tax rate that Woodrow Wilson had put into place during World War I, dropping that 91% tax rate back down to 25%, which he did. So he lowered taxes, he massively deregulated the government, he started privatizing government functions, and it led straight to the Republican Great Depression, which is what it was called until the 1950s, the early 1950s. They basically stopped calling it the Republican Great Depression around the time Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952. And then they just started calling it the Great Depression. I prefer calling it the Republican Great Depression to distinguish it from others. I mean, we've had several, right, in the history of this country. But in any case, what we find is that Eisenhower saved the party from itself by saying, we're not going to go down that crazy road. And then Goldwater came along in '64 and said, no, the crazy road, craziness in defense of liberty is no vice, right? I mean, he used the word extremism, but you get my point. And the Republican Party's back at it. They're back to trying to be essentially the old Confederacy, repudiating democracy and hating on people and using hate as a wedge issue and using race as a wedge issue and all this kind of stuff. And now we've got, this is just incredible. The guy who's the lawyer for Jacob Chainsley. Jacob Chainsley is the Q shaman, the guy who stood at Nancy Pelosi's speaker's podium in the House of Representatives with his, giant Viking horns, in his face all painted and the fur over his shoulders. This guy's lawyer. His name is Watkins. He comes out and he says his client has a disturbed mental state, and the problem is Trump's propaganda. He says, quote, a lot of these defendants, and I'm going to use this colloquial term perhaps disrespectfully, but they're all effing short bus people. These are people with brain damage. They're effing retarded. They're on the damn spectrum. But, he continues, keep in mind, this is the lawyer for one of the guys who invaded the Capitol. But they're our brothers, our sisters, our neighbors, our co-workers. They're part of our country. These aren't bad people. They don't have prior criminal history. They were subjected to 4+ years of damn propaganda, the likes of which the world has not seen since effing Hitler. You've got another one who is claiming Foxitis. He watched Fox News. That's why he invaded the Capitol. Over on PLOS One, there's new research that was it is a scientific journal that was just published there. It's summarized over at SciPost.org about a study of Trump supporters. In fact, the headline, the article is by Beth Elwood in PSYPost.org. Study pinpoints 2 aspects of pathological narcissism that predicted the intention to vote for Trump in 2020. There were actually 2 personality characteristics that they tested people for, and they were able to predict who would vote for Trump or had voted for Trump and who would or hadn't, based on their scores on these two pieces of what is called narcissism. You'll recall, I think it was Greek mythology, Narcissus, the guy who was so in love with his own reflection in the pond that he, ended up falling in and drowning or something like that. But narcissism isn't just self-love. It actually involves exaggerated self-importance and a disregard for the lives of other people. These are called antagonistic, the antagonistic facet of narcissism, and the indifferent facet of narcissism in psychology speak. And if they looked at these two characteristics, the antagonistic, in other words, they think that I am more important than anybody else in the world, and this disregard for other people, the inability to empathize with other people, in fact, kind of almost on the sociopathy spectrum. The author of this study, Dr. Matthew Yalch, Y-A-L-C-H, suggests that people with inflated self-images combined with the susceptibility to feeling undervalued were attracted to Trump's grandiose personality. In other words, Beth Elwood writes, in other words, people with narcissistic tendencies themselves might be drawn to Trump's narcissistic persona, looking to defend their worth by identifying with his entitled and aggressive ways. Now, let me boil this down. What they're essentially saying is that, like in every other country, we have a mental health problem in the United States. But our mental health problem is different than that in many other countries, in that we don't treat people with mental illness. We celebrate them or ignore them. Yesterday, Louise was walking home and alone, and a homeless guy who was clearly a paranoid schizophrenic threw a water bottle at her and started screaming and chasing her. I mean, Ronald Reagan dumped 40,000 mentally ill people out of institutions when he became president. And we have had this homeless problem ever since that has been, obviously, there's an economic homeless problem, but there's also a mental illness homeless problem. So, number one, we ignore them. Or number two, the mentally ill people who are still functioning, they can still hold down a job, but they're nuts. They're narcissists. They have no regard for other people, and they think they're the center of the universe. We have an entire political party that caters to them, that is led by a guy who is one of them. Other countries treat mental illness, other developed countries. They offer help to people like the guy who was chasing Louise down the street. Or they offer help to the people, like these people who stormed the Capitol building because they were Trump voters, Trump followers. But here in America, no. It's become, mental illness has become the touchstone for the Republican Party. Another aspect of what I was calling bullying earlier. These are narcissists.